Looks like the break is over, and I hope you can all hear me. I see no sign to the contrary, so let's assume that this is the case. Roland Betancourt in Irvine is saying yes, and that's the most important thing that we wish to know about at this morning. So a warm welcome to you all from Vienna this evening, and welcome to this installment of the online Edinburgh Byzantine Book Festival, a wonderfully successful event for which all involved deserve to be congratulated, especially its initiator, Petros Bouras-Vallianatos. I'm Claudia Rapp, Professor of Byzantine Studies at the University of Vienna and Director of the Division of Byzantine Research at the Austrian Academy of Sciences. It's my great pleasure and privilege, indeed, to be chairing this session dedicated to Roland Betancourt's important book, Performing the Gospels in Byzantium, Sight, Sound, and Space in the Divine Liturgy, that is almost available in print, and I'm grateful to Cambridge University Press for making a preprint version accessible to me. Roland Betancourt is Professor of Art History at the University of California in Irvine, and my great regret is that I left UCLA before he arrived on the West Coast. It would have been wonderful to do things there together. He was awarded at the University of California, Irvine, the distinction of Chancellor's Fellow from 2019 to 2022, so that's still ongoing. Previously, he spent a year as the Elizabeth and J. Richardson Dilworth Fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. Betancourt's work has looked at the role of Byzantine art in modern and contemporary art and popular culture, as in his edited volume Byzantium/Modernism, The Byzantine as Method in Modernity, published in 2015. His first monograph, Sight, Touch, and Imagination in Byzantium, published in 2018, is in some ways a prequel to the current book. It proposes a new understanding of theories of vision in the ancient Greek and Byzantine worlds by distancing sight from touch and placing a central focus on the workings of the imagination. He is also the author of Byzantine Intersectionality, published last year, on the intersection of race, sexuality, and gender identity in the medieval world. So a very wide range of interests, all centered on the experience of the visual in its particular context and the multivalence of these experiences. Betancourt obtained his PhD from Yale, where his intellectual trajectory was shaped by Robert Nelson, who himself began his career as an art historian with a study of illuminated gospel books and subsequently became ever more interested in Byzantine ways of seeing. In many important articles on the Byzantine liturgy as an event, its texts, objects, and contexts, Betancourt advocates that we must consider, I quote, the Byzantine liturgical program as a unified and creative whole rooted in the complexities of lived performance, whose meanings could never have been exhaustively described by extant images or texts. I think that's a quote that really summarizes what you're after in your work, coming from your important article on the Thessaloniki Epitaphios. The book that he will present in a moment, Performing the Gospels, brings all these aspects to the fore and much more, because he also draws on the acoustic experience, which has recently been highlighted in work by Visura Pencheva and also Sharon Gerstel. The book, and I quote from one of the key sentences, looks across manuscript illumination and liturgical space with the goal of contextualizing how image, text, sound, and architecture operate alongside one another to produce polyvalent images, images that flicker across multiple readings and spectrums of possibility. And it's that aspect that I find the most fascinating, this concept of procedurality, as you call it, that is the possibility to reassemble elements that one perceives at different moments in time in order to gain an ever different impression and experience that you apply to the liturgical performance and the liturgical experience. In the sense, procedurality is defying the internal logic of narrative, which always has a direction, a beginning and an end, as determined by the author. Important here is the role of the lector, the reader, as the one who actually sees the manuscripts. At the center of your study are 11 illuminated gospel books, or a number of illuminated gospel books, usually from the 11th century, along with those who accompany him to the ambo, who hold the candles and are standing there also seeing the manuscript. It's the lector who transforms the words and the images on the page into sound that is perceived by the participants in liturgy, who form images in their own mind, and which are in addition also inspired by the tone of the recital, visual cues from the church, and the sense of smell. That is not elaborated here, but we could talk about that perhaps in the discussion. What becomes possible as a result is the agency of the viewer or the listener. And I think that's also a recurring theme that runs through your work, the agency of the viewer and the listener as she experiences the liturgical performance in ever new and different ways that may or indeed may not be intended by those who masterminded the performance, those who performed the liturgy, but also those who constructed the church building and those who decorated it. Taking this observation to the meta level of self-reflection, you end the book with a disclaimer of your own role as art historian and interpreter, because you say you wish to see the book as an effort to, quote, open up spaces where slippages, confusions, and misdirection are possible. In this sense, we're greatly looking forward to your presentation today and to the discussion that ensues. As before, you are encouraged to write your questions in the chat, and I will then read the questions to Betancourt. And so without further ado, we look forward to your presentation and the discussion that follows.
Thank you so much. That was such a wonderful introduction. It sort of makes my presentation on some level unnecessary, I think. But I really appreciate it. A great understanding of the book. Can everyone see my slides okay? Great. Yeah, so I can begin by saying, since you mentioned the epilogue, this is in some ways an unwieldy project in what it covers. And I think that's what I have always loved about it. This has been a project that's been going on for some time. I began it early on in my graduate career, and it really was the sort of focal point and center of my dissertation work. So it's truly evolved over the past 10 years and more in many ways. And my goal was always to really try to chart the experience of the lectionary from text all the way to its sort of recitation and sort of presentation in the minds of the readers. The book in many ways began from this challenge to understand marginalia in gospel lectionaries and historiated initials, with the understanding that historiated initials in particular really emerge in the post-iconoclastic period, have this immense sort of flourishing around the end of the 11th century with a sort of, let's consider there a long 11th century. The dating is really somewhat more expansive than that. And then they sort of fade away. And that was always very intriguing to me, and particularly the extensive use of marginalia in lectionaries. Because unlike books where you can, of course, as many Western medieval art historical studies do, in books where you can pause, read at your own pace, marginalia have a very interesting role. They can subvert the text, they can play on different meanings. They really are guides and provocations as to how you read. And so in Byzantine lectionaries, these marginalia are quite literal, hyper-literal at times, and that's really what a lot of the book in the first few chapters covers. This literality that really tries to embody almost the word immediately next to it, sometimes using the image to fill in adjectives and so forth, rather the nouns of the adjectives and so forth. So there's this word image interaction that is quite specific and almost textual in its handling of the images. But of course, the big challenge here is that in a lectionary that is meant to be chanted, to be read aloud, there is a sort of pace that you have to follow. And so there isn't that standard idea of contemplation in the way that we might imagine it for particularly Western marginalia. Of course, thinking, of course, the great work of Michael Camille with the powers of subversion of marginalia. And so with that imperative, I was confronted also with the idea that then a lot of scholars have assumed these books therefore were a sort of coffee table book, which is my favorite sort of straw man argument to go against, which is the provocation to think, how are they more than just these lavishly illuminated manuscripts? Is there something about these inclusion of images that tell us something about how images work in the peripheries in Byzantium? And also, what role does this highly calibrated system have in sort of subverting some of our notions or understandings of the text? And so through careful visual analysis over the years and spending a lot of time with these images and the text, this book really emerged, walking me slowly through, first the text, the history initials, how they standardly interact with each other, and then beginning to see the moments where scribes might have committed errors, where there's a sort of pushback against the text or a cross-referencing of other narratives across the Gospels. And so I will begin a little bit by just showing you a breakdown of the book, and I'm going to sort of run through each of the chapters very briefly to give you a sense of the book's trajectory. I can say that the book is lavishly illustrated as well, with over 120 full-color images. Many of these images, I can discuss this a little bit further, are quite unique in their production or access, and I'll say more about that as we run through the chapters. And so my goal here was really to trace the text from text to illustration, onward to reading, and then to what happens when that sound is out in the space of the church. And so in many ways, the book creates this narrative by understanding these lavishly illuminated manuscripts within the space of Hagia Sophia, understanding that many of these manuscripts have been ascribed to a patriarchal circle, and therefore using Hagia Sophia as a great exemplar to think about what are some of the potential dynamics that these images could have, not only on the page, but in the way that the imagination works to give sort of readers a vision in their mind that echoes the types of images that the readers would have been seeing in the sort of peripheries of their sight. So I divide the book into two sections, one the lectionary and the other the liturgy, to think about image text dynamics and then sound and architecture dynamics, always returning back to the manuscripts as an anchoring point to think about things like chant marks and so forth, and understand even the ways in which slippages, absences, confusions in the illustrations might say something to us about the acoustic practices and the cultures of sound of the period. And so I begin in a way that really anchors this book very intentionally with my first book, by looking at Photius's homily on the Virgin and how it begins with a sort of imperative to be silent, and thinking about the role that sound here has in this very sort of poetic transition of from silence to speaking, beginning with the word silence. And there I begin with a close textual analysis that anchors us in the idea of how a slowly recited text, particularly thinking about Greek syntax, can really have confusing meanings, paradoxical readings, as it slowly unfurls in the space of the church. One of the most exciting things that I think the work by Bishop Bencheva has shown us is not simply about the reverberations of the church, but the ways in which, in order to make texts and chants and hymns legible, the reader often would have to slow down their pace in the reading in order to accommodate for the reverberations of the space, which of course would vary from day to day depending on the crowds in the Church of Hagia Sophia. And so thinking about how that affects the understanding of text is sort of my anchoring point, with of course a nod back to my work in my first book that is very much anchored on Photius's homily on the Virgin. And what's interesting here is in the same period that Photius is writing this homily, we have the emergence of these historiated initials with sort of human figures and these expressions of speech, as I'm showing you here on the right, with the epsilon being created with the hand of which is formed in a speaking gesture in the center of that hasta line to create the text. So beginning here with the inklings of these initials to their flourishing in subsequent centuries. So here I begin with a sort of general introduction to this problem of the interrelations between text, image, and sound and recitation. Moving on then to really lay out a visual grammar and syntax for how these images tend to work in these manuscripts. And so it's really a rundown of how, for example, a miniature works in relationship to a historian initial, a headband, and any marginalia. So I'm really here in this chapter setting forth that grammar, vocabulary, syntax that these manuscripts tend to use in order to establish sort of what we could expect. What is the standard that we might find if we open one of these books? And this is, of course, a difficult chapter to...
Sorry to interrupt, but
yes.
if we want to have time for discussion, I think you have to keep an eye on the clock.
Okay, I will do that. So I will move on then to this transition to questions of failure and error, which is really when I begin to build on that to think about these various pushbacks against what is standard in the manuscript. And I wanted to just briefly note that a lot of the images from this book come, particularly for the ones from Mount Athos, come from the Patriarchal Institute, where I've been able to redigitize some of the images that were originally done from the 1970 volume. So I reproduce a lot of very new images that we haven't really seen in published print in a while. So after that chapter, I go into thinking more about the cultural practices of sound and recitation, thinking, for example, the way that miniatures play with this idea of reciting as a form of possession, and thinking about the chains of transmission between writer, reader, and listener in these narratives of describing recitation as sort of these chains of possession and taking over the body. To then shift into the space of Hagia Sophia and do some close readings, particularly at the spaces that, for example, represent a lectionary, as in this plaque over the imperial doorway, and the way in which these texts are represented in the manuscript tradition, focusing in particular at the omission of certain words like the word salvation, which is interestingly omitted in this plaque over the imperial doorway of Hagia Sophia, almost denying the salvation that you will encounter in the space, to then enter the space of Hagia Sophia and understand how the various images in that space played not only with the location of the empress, the location of the emperor, and the rituals occurring there, but also the types of images across the church and within the text, and of course the bindings of the lectionaries and so forth. Sort of bringing together not just one reading of one-to-one iconography, but showing really this polyvalent rhetoric of these images and how they operate in the space. And so with that, I will close up very quickly, and I can return to any of these images, but I'm happy now to take your questions.